In a world of Marvel, sparkling vampires, and sisterhoods of traveling pants, one movie stands above them all. There is no rival, there is no equal, there is only Son of Godzilla. You're listening to the Kaiju Apostle Podcast.
Yeah, well, welcome back to the Kaiju Apostle Podcast, a deep dive into Toho's rich history of monster films and discovering what lies beneath the surface. I am Chris, not Son of Godzilla, and I am joined by the astonishing David, who, are you Son of Godzilla?
No, I'm son of Dave and Barbara.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's cute.
Oh, I had to do that for you, man, because we've been building up to this episode for a while now.
And then I have to sit here silently. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm excited for this though. You've referenced Minilla almost every single episode, I think, up to this point. Pretty close, at least.
I finally can meet him now.
Yeah, I know.
There's like three things that have to happen for me to have a complete podcast. It's Minilla, shipping, and mentioning Godzilla 98.
Okay. I know we'll at least have two of those, so we'll figure out how to shoehorn in the third. So before we get into the plot summary, I had a few corrections I wanted to make with the last episode, and that's from my lack of thorough research. So the first one is, you know how we had talked about King Kong not being used in Ebra, and I had mentioned it had to do with rights. I was actually thinking a little bit further ahead. We'll see a movie that King Kong was going to be in, but he was not allowed to be because of rights. What happened in this instance is Shinichi Sekizawa had submitted a script to Rankin Bass, but they rejected it. So then at that point, Toho scrapped it, and well, I guess they didn't scrap it, they put Godzilla in. But we'll see down the road, Toho and Rankin Bass were able to come together to make a movie. Also, I had mentioned that Tsuburaya had received honorable credits for special effects in Ebra, but he didn't actually do the work. That was Sadamasa Arikawa. So he did the special effects for this film, being Son of Godzilla and Ebra as well. But obviously, Tsuburaya was just so influential in all of this that they gave him his honorable mention because of that. So,
Nice place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, let's go ahead and we are discussing, I think this is probably the quickest we've ever got into a movie. We're just so excited.
No world events to talk about.
No, none at all. None at all. Yeah, we're just going to go ahead and jump right in discussing the 1967 film Son of Godzilla.
So the year is 1967, I think. And the United Nations has sent a team of scientists to Solgull Island to figure out the problem of world hunger by developing a weather-changing device, as one does.
Mm-hmm.
After weeks of preparation, they're almost ready for their first test, but not before reporter Goro Maki parachutes onto the island with a nose for the hottest scoop. He's welcomed into the crew, not knowing he will witness the story of a lifetime. Well, unless you live in this world, and it's a story of many, many lifetimes. This machine ends up malfunctioning, causing the local giant praying mantis to grow hundreds of feet tall. Not to mention the eventual presence of Godzilla when he's drawn to the cry of a baby Godzilla. And, well, that's what we think he is, so we'll just call him Minilla. The team also ends up discovering Seiko, a woman who has spent the past few decades on the island and just barely managed to not die because of the scientists' lack of thorough surveying. Between the Kamakuras, a giant spider named Kamonga, and Godzilla and Minilla, our crew have had their hands full. But after a series of shenanigans and a finally successful attempt, they managed to leave the island, leaving behind the new father and his son freezing to death. Yikes. Kind of a dick move there, right?
Yeah,
he
just
got
a little
a kid
bit.
And now he's freezing to death. It's like the end of Titanic.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely room for more than one person on there. So staff wise, first of all, I want to actually give a shout out to Wikizilla. Obviously, there's multiple people involved on that site, but just the amount of work that they put into, keeping everything updated. We're constantly relying on them for staff and cast because IMDb, I don't know. I just can't trust them. So this movie is directed by the Ryan Johnson of Godzilla films, Jun Fukuda. It was written by Shinichi Sekizawa and Kazu Kiba. So it was actually the first female writer on a Godzilla film. So that was interesting. Producer was Tomoyuki Tanaka. Surprise. Music was Masaru Sato. Cinematography was Kazuo Yamada. And special effects, as we had mentioned, was Arikawa. Now, the cast, I feel like this is one of so far, probably I'm trying to think of the right word. There's more recognizable faces in this film, I feel like, than almost any other that we've had so far. And granted, we've watched multiple films, but Fukuda managed to get some of the best in this movie. So we have Tadao Takashima as Dr. Kasumi, Babari Maeda as Psycho, Akira Kubo as Goro Maki, and then Akihiko Harada as Fujisaki, not a doctor. Kenji Sahara is Morio. And then Yoshio Tsuchiya is Furukawa. And then Yasuhiko Saijo as Suzuki. So he is Ippei from Ultra Q. And then Kinichiro Maruyama as Ozawa. And then Saishiro Kuno as Toshiro. I included them because they're in the main cast, but I don't think we've really seen them in a prominent role before. And then in the beginning of the film, we see Susumu Kurobe as the plane captain. He also plays Hayata in the original Ultraman. And then for the actual monsters, we get Seiji Onaka and Hiroshi Sakita as Godzilla. But Haru Nakajima does Godzilla for the water scenes. And what's interesting, so this is the first film that I'm aware of that we have 3 different people playing Godzilla in one film. So Onaka started out playing Godzilla, but he ended up hurting himself. So that's when Sakita took over. Okay, and then lastly, we have Misao Fukazawa as Minya. I believe Little Man Machan is what he was referred to. I believe he was a professional wrestler, if I remember right.
A lot of professional wrestlers in these movies.
I know, right? So I could be wrong there. I'm sure I'll have to correct myself if I am. Really the only piece of trivia here, so going into Kalat's book, he kind of waxes poetically about the original sin and science and all this stuff, but he doesn't really get into much trivia here. And then obviously the Shiro Honda biography, you're not going to get much into a Fukuda film. But on Wikizilla, what I didn't realize is, we're talking about dick moves at the end of the movie. Apparently there was a scene shot, but it was cut, where Godzilla leaves Minya behind on the island as it's freezing, but then he turns around and embraces him there at the end.
Oh.
Yeah, I was I'm kind of glad they cut that. I mean, I don't know. I get the idea, but that would have been a little jarring, I feel like.
Yeah. After the whole movie. I mean, oh, yay, they reconnected. But yeah, that is weird.
Yeah. So, poll, I'm still laughing at the fact that this poll has had the most votes out of any poll that we've done so far. So the question was, where did Minya come from? So we had 4 options. One was another Godzilla, which got 29.7% of the votes. Toho's basement, which got 29% of the votes. A surprising 9% of votes went to Mothra plus Godzilla, which I was very surprised by. I thought we had more trolling fans than that.
He has his mother's wings.
Mm-hmm. And then 32.4% of the votes went to the deepest pits of hell.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. I will say we had someone insinuate that Dio from the previous film in Godzilla got it on. And yeah, I'm still kind of weighing out whether I should block that person or not. So let's get into
the brevy of distressing images.
I know. It's yeah. So as we do for each episode, we try to have a conversation going about the movie itself, right? So for Son of Godzilla, it seems like Ebro received a lot of positive responses, but Son of Godzilla is almost continually more divisive, right? So
Mm.
most of the critiques I've seen about this movie have been directed at Minya. So my question was, is that fair, unfair? You tell us. And really, the consensus that I got was that most people don't hate Minya, but they're not a fan of him. But we did get a lot of really good comments of just like, um, Faye, for example, said it's unfair. The movie's solely judged, in my opinion, over Minya's design, and that's it. The plot is good, the characters are fun, and it has some of the best effects. So Eric Schuster says, Son of Godzilla has some of the most impressive visual effects in the series. One of the most genuinely touching endings with father and son embracing as their world freezes over. People make fun of the Godzilla design in this one, but it embodies Tired Dad pretty well. Also, Minya is cute and he's super strong. And he killed, edited out for not spoiling Chris's viewing experience later on.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I want to make sure to do that. Giant Monster BS actually said unfair. Kids used to throw nails at me when I rode my bike in the driveway. One day they were hurling nails my way, and Minya walked up holding a baseball bat. He told me to go inside for 10 minutes. Ever since that day, those kids have disappeared from the face of the earth. Yeah, still processing that one. But I will say, we had a lot of people come to Son of Godzilla's defense, but there is one comment that stood out to me the most.
Mm.
It was, Son of Godzilla is my least favorite by far. Every Godzilla movie isn't a home run, but this was like getting pegged in the face, and they don't even allow you to get on base because you're knocked out cold for an hour and a half.
Oh wow. So this really is the last Jedi of Godzilla.
Yeah, and that was kind of what we were talking about yesterday, where when I make a comment of Ryan Johnson, it's not that Fukuda wanted to go back to the spirit or, wanted to deconstruct Godzilla. I mean, Fukuda very clearly did not enjoy doing these, but it is a very divisive movie for sure. In some ways, I feel like it'll be more divisive than when we discuss Godzilla's Revenge, or All Monsters Attack. But Chris, I mean, like I said, this is the movie you had been looking forward to for so long. So did it meet your expectations? Did you find yourself overwhelmed? Were you just whelmed? Like, tell us, just dish, man, dish.
Well, I mean, we all know my existence is based on memes. My
Mhm.
personality is memes. So, of course I had to be looking forward to this. But I think while watching it, I realized I wasn't the main target.
Mhm.
I can't say that I was like, "Oh, actually this really is a masterpiece." But I could say like okay, I'm not gonna answer your question, but hopefully that I'll get back to it for a minute. Like, they talk about going from Return of the Jedi to Phantom Menace. The audience has grown 16 years, and they're expecting a movie that grew with them, but instead they're searching back to the beginning
Mhm.
for like new kids. And so the adults are bummed, but the kids like it. Um, and so like that 16-year gap creates that expectation gap that makes you like super bummed when a movie like this comes out. I feel like I wasn't really disappointed because a we just watched Ebra 2 weeks ago.
Mhm.
So like I don't have this big long build up to expect what the next movie's going to be. So I think watching this 40 years later, almost 50 years later actually, I can do math. Like helped me enjoy it better. Um like I'm thinking of like when Scrappy Doo comes out and Scooby, like there's been so much Scooby content that like you can just watch something else if you don't like the kid themed
Mhm.
one. But I would rather see like an actual child kaiju be like the childish jokes and kind of the one who brings down the tone instead of like having uh Godzilla do the TikTok dance. You know what I mean?
I think so. Because I mean, I'm just gonna nod and pretend like I know what the TikTok dance is. So
I would perform it for you, but on this auditory visual experience of a podcast, I think it would be lost on our audience.
So you're going to deny me the pleasure of seeing it.
Yeah. You'll have to
Okay.
follow me on my new TikTok account.
So yeah, I mean, I would say if you were watching these movies at the time, you know, you're going from Invasion of Astro Monster to Ebra. I mean, there's a very clear change in tone and direction. And then going into Son of Godzilla, like I've seen a lot of people say, you know, this movie is marketed towards kids, but you could argue that the movies had progressively already been doing that.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, this is definitely a much different film than Invasion of Astro Monster or Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. So I think you're right. I mean, if you don't like this film now, well, there's 30 other films you could watch, right? But then, well, if you wanted to watch the newest Godzilla film, you'd need to get your butt in the sea and watch it.
Yeah. Well, we can't get our butt in the film to watch the newest one.
No, we probably never will.
Yeah, at this rate. Yeah, but there's something I don't know. We've talked at length how I'm a bad franchise fan. We've talked
Yes.
at length how I'm a bad movie fan. But
Yes.
I think any franchise that gets like more than 3 movies really needs like their weird one-off movie. Everything needs its like little strange like what were they thinking? And so for that I really appreciate Minya. I think he's like that fun little ounce of weird that any long-running franchise really needs.
Hmm.
And really, I feel like though, you know, you could say the same for kids, but I think there's probably something about like if you grew up watching the first couple and now Godzilla's becoming a parent at the same time you are. I wonder if there was something there for like new fathers who might have been seeing something in this movie.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's the thing. And we'll get into that. But like, this is a much deeper film than I think Ebra was. And I think even, you know, in my opinion, I think there's more to discuss here than even like War of the Gargantuas, right? And
Hmm.
I don't know if that's necessarily intentional, but as we've already discussed, that's not always the case, right? I mean, you could create, once you kind of release art into the world, it's up to the viewers or the readers to do what they want with it. That's
Hmm.
kind of what frustrates me sometimes about George Lucas is like he always wanted to edit and change his movies, but it's like once it's out there,
Hmm.
you know. And now I think that's also part of the reason why so many people are so upset with the changes that we see because you know, you have the end of Return of the Jedi and people had taken that movie and created their own stories with it. And now all of a sudden you have these movies that come in and, you know, change that. Or you had, you know, Disney and Lucasfilm take these old novels and pretty much erase them. So of course people are going to be upset. Um, so yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think this was a very needed change. Um, I don't know why it came to mind, but I was thinking of John 3:8, where you know the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who's born of the Spirit. Not that like Jun Fukuda is the Holy Spirit, but like he was just making this movie, and the franchise is so much bigger than just one person,
Hmm.
right? So it's doing these changes, and either you can go with it or you're not, but I don't think the changes are necessarily bad. Um, I don't think, honestly, before I started this project and getting back into the films, you know, I actually viewed these movies negatively because, you know, I had this perception that, you know, the Showa films were campy, they weren't serious. Like I said, you know, we'll get into that here in a minute. Um, so overall, though, you felt like you enjoyed it for what it was.
Yeah, I think for what it was pretty good. And I think I'd really honestly think you talk about Lucas doing the special editions. I would rather just see franchises deal with their own messy legacy.
McClunky.
Yeah. Uh, like, hopefully that be the end of it. But I would rather see franchises deal with their legacy as it is rather than
Mhm.
retconning.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the answer is after King Kong versus Godzilla allegedly comes out, if the next one is like an updated Godzilla and Minya movie, where it's just kind of like, updated graphics, whatever the kids are talking about these days. But like, just say if we're gonna bring everything else back, is there a way we can keep playing in this space where he's a dad, where he picks up a kid. I think, I don't know. I think I'd be curious to see what we would do with it now. Because I think this whole thing where we get embarrassed about the history of our favorite franchises just seems silly. I'd rather we just embrace them. I think the self-seriousness of the Gareth Edwards Godzilla was fun at times, but I don't want them all to be like grimdark Batman movies. I'd love to see some of the camp like this put back in.
And what's funny is you say the grimdark of Batman movies, but I would argue the majority of Batman movies haven't been.
That's true. I mean, you've got either Bat Nips or Adam West.
Yeah, exactly. I will say here in a couple months, you may potentially see the whole Godzilla's father thing brought back up, but we'll get there when we get there. So let's talk about everyone's favorite monster, Minilla, right?
Mm-hmm.
Moist Minilla. He comes out of the egg and he's just wet and sticky. And I honestly like watching this again. I mean, because this is honestly a film I will gladly put on just to watch. I think to me, that is the only form of Minilla that's like disgusting, right? One of our listeners made a comment of, well, you know, no babies are born. You know, that's kind of indicative of how babies are. I'm like, as a parent, I'll disagree. Like I've even kids who aren't my own, like I've seen cute babies and I've also seen ones that are, very similar to Minilla. So I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast rule. But yeah, I think that's kind of when people think of Minilla as gross or grotesque or disgusting, they just think of that first Minilla with the embryonic fluids just all over his body. And I'm trying to obviously be as graphic as possible.
Yeah.
Really. But then once he, gets his kind of more donkeyish face, like he's cute, he's endearing, right? I mean,
well, and that's the funny thing about it, because every time I've looked him up to like meme him or put him in my top 5 kaiju lists, even before I'd seen it.
Would he be in your top 8 on MySpace?
Oh gosh, yeah. I did have to remove Tom so I could put Minilla in.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure. What is Tom doing though? I'm sorry. Like I've thought about that. Like, so Twitter, we have Jack, right? And he always puts his foot in his mouth. But like, I don't remember there ever being a negative thing about Tom.
That's true. And MySpace is still going.
Is it? I knew it came back, but then it wasn't streets ahead. So it kind of went streets behind.
But no, I've still seen people link to it intentionally and not ironically.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm just like, man, Tom is an enigma.
He really, because it was the same profile picture the whole time too.
Yeah. Like, how did he do that?
Yeah.
That's what you call a lot of self-will and determination.
Oh gosh. Well, he was a prophet. He foresaw what would happen when he spoke on the internet.
Tom Stradamus.
So he decided not to.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny because, like, I always laugh because when people share pictures of their newborns on Facebook, I'm like, ooh, that one's fresh, isn't it? You just cleaned him off. And then sometimes when they show you pictures of newborns and you're like, ooh, could you not? That little potato. But,
oh, my little spud.
My little spud. But I'd never seen Moist Minilla before.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the movie started, I was like, oh my God, what have I been seeing?
Yeah.
Is this going to be the majority? So, God. But I don't know. For him to have the reputation of being Moist Minilla seems unfair because I've looked. I have scoured the internet for pictures of little guy, and I've never seen that. So it kind of cracked me up.
Well, there's a reason for that. It is absolutely horrifying.
True. You don't call him Moist Minilla because you like it.
No. So... yeah, so I think that's kind of this idea. And maybe there are people who don't like the actual Minilla design, which is fine. I mean, to be honest, between Moist Minilla and the actual Godzilla suit we have, there's definitely some critiques that are valid for sure. I know there is an argument that, well, bad suit designs or whatever shouldn't make a movie bad. But then I also, like, on the one hand, I agree with that. But then I'm also kind of like, but it's still valid to not like those things either, right? Like that is part of it. But something I want to get into is I've seen the argument leveled towards this movie that Godzilla is a bad dad, right? So he stomps on Minya's tail in order to help him learn how to breathe fire. He kind of like slaps him across the head. He drags him by the tail, right? We talked about how technically it is the movie where he walks off and then he comes back. Just because it's cut doesn't mean that they filmed it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is this perception of Godzilla being a bit more abrasive than what is perceived to be normal for adults with their kids now, human adults, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And like on the one hand, I don't want to make light of people who actually like might find some connection there with their own upbringing, because obviously abusive parents are a very real thing. I kind of have to wonder, like, at what point do we take that too far, right? Because Godzilla is not a human being. Like, I'm not a zoologist, but I have to imagine that the standards that we have as human beings can't just be transposed onto like wolves or lions or anything like that, right? So if Godzilla is a monster, is it fair for me to say, because as a dad, I wouldn't do this, therefore if Godzilla does it, he's a bad dad? And like, I know that seems silly. I'm not trying to be pedantic, but I feel like there's a point where if we're discussing fictional movies, we need to be able to make those distinctions, right? So we're not talking about a portrayal of an actual boy and his dad. We're talking about monsters. So how do you feel about that? Like, how far should we take Godzilla's humanization, so to speak, before we realize that it's not one-to-one?
Right. That actually reminds me of a tweet I saw last night where the OP was legitimately, non-ironically saying, like, we always blame bad dads, but what if the kid gives off bad vibes? And so I was kind of thinking about it, actually. But yeah, I think this is where you hit the weird. The balance has become weird now because they've been trying to humanize Godzilla for a while, but at the core he's still like an irradiated lizard, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like if I watched a bird like push its baby out of the nest, I wouldn't go, "Oh God, look at that." I'd be like, "Oh yeah, that's what happens."
Exactly.
Like that's how you do it. So maybe there's something that gets a little too close to home when you humanize him too badly or too much. Like, yeah, you wouldn't like slap a kid because he can't hit the T-ball, but we do like physically push them, like telling them they're dogging it when they're playing basketball. So I don't know. It's a very careful consideration, but I also wonder, like, not to excuse bad behavior, but if Godzilla's not really the dad, he's trying to figure it out. He just gets this baby dropped on his doorstep. Like, he's gonna suck. He doesn't have
Yeah.
those maternal instincts. So, but
Yeah.
maybe he is. I guess my question is, you deconstruct Godzilla's parenting model, which is fine if you want to do that, but like, to what end? I mean, Godzilla's not gonna read our reviews and go, "Oh crap, I've been a bad dad. I gotta fix it." Like,
Bad dad.
I guess I'm just curious what the end goal of calling him a bad dad is.
Mm-hmm.
To make him look bad, he is in fact a villain.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah, like what satisfaction are we getting from shaming a fictional monster?
Yeah. Right.
But I think you said something that's actually really important. So there's two things. What?
You think?
Sorry, I realized how horrible that sounded. So I didn't think about this before. So yes, I mean, Godzilla, this is not his child. And that's really made clear in external sources. So if you're watching this movie and you have no reference to that, you might actually think it is his, right? They don't really give you any indication that it's not, even though I am confused. Like, how could they tell it was a baby Godzilla when it was born? Like, I wouldn't look at that and be like, "Ooh, baby Godzilla."
Right. It's like the first one they've seen.
Yeah, exactly.
Allegedly.
So something to think about is Godzilla was drawn to Minya's brainwaves, right? That's what we see, the interference and all the different, radio signals and all that. So there was that, that parental drive there. But you're right. This is not his kid. And I think about myself. So this is like a complete moment of vulnerability that I don't think I've done on a podcast before. So when we had Jasper, we had a fairly normal delivery process and all that. But they didn't go over what is now known as purple crying, right? Just this idea that like kids crying, crying, crying. Sometimes you just need to set the kid down and walk away. You hear about don't shake a baby, right? And in your head, you're like, well, why would I shake a baby? Who would shake a baby? I almost shook Jasper. I'm not a violent person at all. But there was one night where I don't remember what it was, and I was so frustrated, and I didn't have the clarity to put him down, and I almost found myself shaking him because I was so frustrated, right? I
Mhm.
would like to say I'm a good dad. I would like to say that. But I had that moment where I almost made a very serious and bad decision. So you're right, like you have Godzilla as being thrust into this position of not wanting to be not necessarily wanting to be a parent, but I don't think he's planning on it, right? And now he's
Mhm.
trying to figure this out. He doesn't have a village to help him. He just has his evolutionary instincts to try to guide him.
Mhm.
So I say all of that because again, I feel like there's just this point for more niche fandoms like Godzilla, where sometimes I think fans struggle to separate fiction from reality,
Mhm.
right? So we are discussing a fictional movie and we are discussing serious tones. But I know at the end of the day, when that movie is over, I am back in the real world and I have to process this. Like I can use these movies as a tool to process things,
Mhm.
but if I don't know how to process things without these movies, like, I think that needs to be discussed, right? We see people where, when the coronavirus hit or when we see, world catastrophes, fans will continually make correlations of like, oh, I wonder if that's Godzilla and stuff like that. I'm like, I don't think we realize the danger of not being able to view the world outside of this lens.
Mhm.
So with Godzilla being a bad dad, I'm curious how much we're projecting our own experiences onto this movie and not realizing like that's not necessarily the healthiest thing to do. Am I being too uncharitable there?
There does so I don't know if this is exactly what you're going for. So I might be in a different direction.
Mhm,
But there's definitely a difference between like personal triggers
mhm,
and oh, that's what a bad dad looks like. So if you're watching this and it triggers feelings of abuse or triggers like parental dysfunction, I would say like that's not what we're talking about.
exactly.
Like that's like totally legitimate. And maybe even if you haven't seen this movie or if you know some of your friends struggle with it, you might want to do a quick little content warning on that. Just to be like, hey, just so you know, this happens a little bit. It's kind of slapstick, but even like delivery still doesn't trump what you feel. So even if it is slapsticky, if that was your experience, of course you're going to feel that anyway.
Yeah.
So it might be worth referencing that, but like there is something to say like if it's not a triggering thing, you're just trying to score points by knocking Godzilla down. That's when I'm like, well, what do you gain from this?
Yeah.
Like there's like legitimate like I don't know, and I'm forming this thought as I'm talking, which is not usually how I operate. But like we've seen recently a bunch of episodes from like 30 Rock and Scrubs, and apparently even this morning Community have now been scrubbed from streaming services and because of content. I don't know, like this one doesn't seem like the same like scrub it because of content.
No.
This just seems like we have to, this is a monster who was thrust in a position he doesn't like. He's been mostly a villain his whole life. He stands for the after effects of atomic violence. He's not going to be a great dad.
Yeah, he's
So,
dealing with trauma himself, right?
yeah.
You
And I
know.
mean, that's if there's anything there, like, of course, this probably is not what the movie makers were going to say, but like, there is that generational trauma that's passed down and
Mhm.
hurt people,
Yeah.
hurt kaiju. Like, so yeah, there is some of that. So just
Yeah.
it's not an excuse, but there's explanations, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think again, my point is that it's not invalid to look at that film and be like, as a parent, these are not proper parenting techniques, right? Yeah, that's absolutely valid. Or if you had gone through those things, to be like, man, like I can relate to that in a way maybe you wouldn't care to admit. But to project external standards onto honestly, like I think this is a really important discussion in regards to like with like race and with just ethics and morals in general. I struggle as a Christian with how do I tell people who are not a Christian to live a certain way, right? Because do I believe that the gospel is for everybody? Absolutely. But I don't believe the gospel is repent or perish. I believe the gospel is Jesus is Lord. The kingdom of God is here. You know, there's this litany of things that we could discuss. So is it fair for me to look at someone who is not a Christian living a certain way and want to hold them to a standard that they aren't striving to live to? In a certain way, like I don't feel like I'm supposed to, right? Yes, there is a spirit that is in this world that calls us all to repentance, but is it my job to say this person should live the way I am if we have two complete worldviews? So when I look at Godzilla, again, he's a monster. He's not a human being. So is it fair for me to say that he should have certain parenting techniques that I would do? No.
Yeah, and especially like when you bring in, when we have conversations about race and diversity and inclusion and desegregation, we're going to constantly come in contact with cultures that are unlike our own, societies that are unlike our own. Like, you know, in the past 50 years, is discussions on, I can't remember. I don't want to use the word third world. I don't want to use developing countries. But like in that framework, I really truly don't like these. But like, you know, as the first world was interacting more with the third world, and you can't see my air quotes, but you know, we had to constantly get over like parents don't like, or parents parent differently in different cultures in ways that aren't abusive, that aren't harmful, that just aren't Western.
Yeah.
And so we had to spend a lot of time as the world becomes more globalized getting over that. But now we're going to come to see like, oh, my Black neighbors might raise their kids differently. Again, in non-abusive and non-harmful ways, but in ways that are different. Or like some might look at us to see like, oh, how long do you make your kid practice the violin every morning? Like hours, and they don't want it? Like that, you know, we get so blind to the ways that we do bad. We have bad cultural practices that we've just given a pass.
Yeah, we've normalized it.
Or yeah, but even like I'm thinking like in terms of Christianity, I don't remember the author's name, so we can put that in the show notes maybe. But there's this great book that came out recently called Rescuing the Gospel from the Cowboys. And it talks about the First Nations response when they would call themselves Christians. But as you see the integration of First Nation symbolism and Christian symbolism come together, and then you have Western Christians say like, no, purge that. That's syncretism. There's no good in your culture.
Yep.
The only good culture is Christian culture. Like we see that all the time where we have to kind of say like, hey, we can like have discussions. We can have these value, I don't want to say comparisons, but we can put them in conversation. And we got to be able to say like, oh, that's not mine, but it may not be bad. I wouldn't kick my kid out of the nest to see if they could fly because that's not how they fly.
Yeah. So side note, it's Rescuing the Gospel from the Cowboys, a Native American expression of the Jesus way by Richard Twiss.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I'm thinking. So like, again, it's taking this idea of what I perceive to be right and projecting or holding someone to a standard that they may not be asking to do. So I think about how in the Western church, we have, I mean, really, the Western church is very centralized in our whiteness, right? So, I mean, I say that because, you know, the typical Protestant Christianity has its roots back to the Protestant Reformation, and that's about it. Whereas you and I have discussed, you know, the roots of Christianity are not only Jewish, but Asian and African as well. So the early church fathers, a lot of them are African or Asian. And, you know, you look at a lot of the longest running church traditions like the Coptics and, you know, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, like they're very clearly not white. And you look at, you know, the largely charismatic and Pentecostal movements within, you know, the Southern Hemisphere down in South America and Africa and all these expressions of Christianity, that are far from being typical white evangelical churches. And who am I to say, well, your church doesn't, your church service doesn't look like mine. You don't worship the same way I do. Therefore, I'm going to try to I think you're right. It's referred to as like syncretism, right? This melding of culture with faith, not acknowledging that American evangelicalism is like the best example of what that looks like, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
but it's white, so it's default, we say.
yeah, we don't know how to separate our culture from our religion. We really don't.
Yeah.
When we have, the idea of "in God we trust" is ingrained into our government itself. I mean, I don't even necessarily think that's a good thing, right? Because we're using the name of God in such profane and crass ways. So 20 minutes later, my point being, yeah, if you think Godzilla's a bad dad, that's fine. But I think it's an unfair reading of the movie when we can't make a distinction between human parental values and a giant irradiated dinosaur, right? Like, we should be able to make those distinctions when we watch a film.
Yeah. And, to bring it to a lighter note, if there's anything that I want to talk about this whole parenthood aspect, it's like, if Godzilla was like originally like a dinosaur who got like maybe superpowers from radiation, but now Minya's born and he has all of this stuff from birth, where's the science?
Well, you could argue that because, the Kamacuras got irradiated through the testing. I mean, who knows what Minya would have looked like in the egg before the test went off.
That was a good answer. I was being a little more tongue-in-cheek.
Oh, I know.
But
I was already thinking it.
That's funny. You just happen to get the exact same superpowers.
Right. Yeah, I know. I mean, let's be honest. It's just kind of... I would like a Godzilla movie where the science logic doesn't just whiff out the window. If anyone gets that reference, please message me. So let's get on to the next topic. The one I'm actually not actually excited for, but something that kind of hit me the other night is this movie is a great vehicle to discuss the topic of creation care and eschatology. So I don't think we've really got into eschatology much on this podcast yet, even though it's like really important to me. But Chris, like, how would you define eschatology for yourself?
Yeah, so really anytime that you would hear it from most evangelical Christians, they're talking about the end of the world, right? Like eschatology. I mean, the word, when you break it down, means it's ology plus eschaton, so the last, like the study of the end. So it's like this ever since the 1900s, like 1908 with the Schofield Bible, but since the 90s with the Left Behind series, it's become like how God's gonna end the world and we're gonna like sneak out just in time. But I think like eschatology, a more healthy view of eschatology is just like living now informed by what we think is going to happen in the future, living now in light of where we know where we're going. So even like for a lot of like Christians, the fundamentalists, eschatology is living in light of the coming rapture, where screw the world, God's going to burn it, and I'm going to be gone. For a lot of maybe more progressive or even just non-fundamentalists, eschatology is knowing Jesus is coming back. So I'm going to live in light of that. Like, because he's coming, I'm going to live differently. I'm going to tell people about him. And there's even like, you could talk about secular eschatologies that says like, right now, the end of the world looks like it's going to be global warming. So in light of that future, I'm going to live this way with sustainability, veganism, with recycling. So we all have eschatologies, just like we all have worldviews and all have religious views.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say there's almost another extreme too. So I was going through N.T. Wright's Surprised by Scripture, and he talks about two extremes when it comes to eschatology. You have the Gnosticism, which you were discussing with this Left Behind, Nikolai Carpathian view that if you suppose that the present world of space, time, and matter is a thoroughly bad thing, then the task is to escape from this world and enable as many others to do so as possible, right? So we see that in the way that evangelicals evangelize is, you want to get as many people to believe the gospel as possible so we can get out of here, right?
Mhm.
But then you have another extreme of being so impressed with the presence and activity of God in the present world that they have supposed God wants simply to go on working as it is, as it. So this idea that, we just need to keep doing what we're doing to perfect the world to get to the point that God has in mind,
Mhm.
right? So there's these two extremes here. Um, and the reason we bring that up is because in this film, we see a very real dilemma of, well, if we don't do something to take care of the food supply, the world's going to end, right?
Mhm.
So, what responsibility do we as Christians have with very real problems in the world, whether it's the, COVID-19, whether it's global warming, food supply, do we just, well, the world's going to end anyway, do we give up, or do we, well, this God has tasked us to solve this problem, therefore we need to throw everything we can towards it. And unfortunately, we're talking about culture and religion and this marriage. I mean, we see that in the way that the religious right has determined policies, because with oil and fracking and everything else, I mean, who has led the charge for that? It's been conservative evangelicals who have had little to no qualms with, well, let's just rape and pillage the earth
Mhm.
for what we need now, not considering what ramifications we have down the road, right? Because, well, the world's going to burn anyway. So what does it matter?
Yeah.
And I would argue that's not a Christian view of the world, of, I guess, a proper Christian eschatological view.
Mhm.
Um, so I guess kind of like, where would you say that balance is like for Christians? Because, we see in Romans 8, we know that the entire creation is groaning together and going through labor pains together up until the present time, right? So
Mhm.
creation obviously is not as it should be, but it doesn't mean that creation is bad. God made the earth. And yes, it did, we see sin entering through Adam and Eve, but God didn't suddenly say creation is bad. It's just it's marred.
Mhm.
It needs to be restored, right? When Jesus says he's returning, it's not we're not going to heaven. He's bringing heaven to earth. It's a new heaven and new earth, but Jesus is coming back and bringing his reign here for restoration. So as Christians, what would you say if you were in this situation in this movie?
Yeah.
What would you say the proper eschatological view would be?
Right. So I think, and this is just my read, but when you look at this movie, I think it kind of matches the Fundy evangelical view, the one that like so in Genesis, right? God
Hmm.
says that the Adam man has dominion over the world, and a lot of people today have taken dominion to mean what you've said, to pillage, to use, to frack, to find oil, instead of like seeking natural resources. Like, we don't need to use renewable energy sources because we have dominion over the planet.
Hmm.
And so it seems to me the same with the scientists who see this problem of world hunger and think we can change the planet to what we need to do. So they take this ownership, and then you create instead Minya and the giant praying mantises. Like, I
Dun,
think
dun, dun,
I
dun,
think when
dun.
we want to respond to uh, ecological issues, we want to see them in light of like what's really the actual problem that's causing this. Because I'm gonna spoil. Have you finished God in the Pandemic yet?
No, I haven't even started.
Okay, so I won't spoil too much, but right, we'll later talk about Romans 8. When you look in the Greek, it says God cooperates with man to bring about the good. So we want to be working with nature, working with God to bring about the actual solutions. And I think part of that is like accurately naming problems.
Hmm.
So like for in this movie, is world hunger a problem because there's not enough food? Or is world hunger a problem because of global capitalism, the hoarding of wealth, the hoarding of resources?
Yeah.
Does do we need to radiate food to make it like bigger? Or do we need to actually just create a fair and equitable supply chain of food that makes its way down through the entirety of different channels to get to the people who need it? And of course, we've both been reading on social justice, and he frequently talks about like
Saint Basil, for those who
Yeah,
haven't
St.
read
Basil,
it.
thank you.
Mhm.
Talks about resources becoming stagnant like water and starting to smell. And what we need to do is keep those resources moving. So when we talk about our relation to natural crises, is it that we don't have enough dominion, that we need to stake a claim in like controlling nature? Or does nature maybe have ways designed by God to supply these needs and we just need to be better cooperating agents with it?
Yeah.
And I think it's more the latter that we're called to.
Well, it almost has something to say about a lack of proper stewardship,
Yeah.
right? So, with the idea of dominion on the earth, so in the ancient Near East, being, like Mesopotamian and Babylonian cultures, for those who aren't familiar with that term, so cultures that were, present at the same time as the Israelites. So we see this idea of Adam and Eve being the icons of God, right?
Hmm.
They're made in the image of God, but they're the icons in the sense that when you went to a temple, you would see imagery of the God. And when you looked at that icon, that was as if you were seeing God himself. It was to display his glory and his presence and his identity into the world. So when Adam and Eve were made as icons, it was meant to be not dominion in the sense of, again, pillaging and raping and abusing and oppressing these resources, but to properly steward and utilize these things in order to have a co-current or concurrent vision with God and how creation should be
Hmm.
used, right? So
Yeah, not autonomous authority,
yeah,
but cooperative stewardship.
exactly. So I think about when, God put Joseph into power in Egypt, he was the one that, helped, not only interpret Pharaoh's dreams, but you see Pharaoh being willing to sell resources and food to starving and hungering um, nations, right? You think about Proverbs 11:26. The people curse him who holds back grain, but a blessing is on the head of him who sells it. And that's
Hmm.
why, we see the Israelites and the Egyptians able to live, harmoniously until the new Pharaoh forgets of Joseph and the previous Pharaoh. And what happens at that point when they forget of the Pharaoh's generosity and is willing to be a good steward? That Pharaoh now becomes a slave master. He oppresses the Israelites, right? So you see
Hmm.
stewardship being in line with oppression. And I
Hmm.
think about, these scientists, the United Nations wanted to take the Sahara and all these so-called unfertile lands and turn them into what was called fertile. But who are they to be judges of what is fertile or not? Were those ecosystems and everything not there for a proper reason,
Hmm.
right? So I think about we view things, they're like, well, these places are unfertile. Well, God is the one who says what is fertile and unfertile. Like you look at Sarah, she was
Hmm.
not fertile, but the Lord said, you will have a child. What did they do? They laughed, right? And then we see Isaac. So I see a lot of like not, as David Clapp puts in Western films, the scientists are typically viewed as madmen, right? Or mad
Hmm.
scientists. And, but in this situation, I mean, I don't think the science is necessarily bad, but I feel like it's misguided. It's unfounded on, this is trying to play God and being
Hmm.
like, well, we need to do this in order for society to survive. But obviously, as a Christian, I believe, Matthew 6, therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat?
Hmm.
Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? The Lord knows that you need all these things, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Don't worry about tomorrow, which obviously is very hard in a COVID-19 world.
Hmm.
Um, so, I resonate with the idea of, I think was it Luther or Calvin that said, Jesus is coming, so plant a tree, right?
Hmm.
This idea that just because we're going to see heaven and earth cohabitate the same space one day doesn't mean that we don't take care of what we have now.
Yeah, right. Well, especially like your point about how stewardship fosters community, maybe we can make explicit the antithesis that certain abuses of capitalism bring about division,
Hmm.
as we've seen like frequently, especially out in the Chicagoland area. The economic economic choices of affluent communities have created many problems for the impoverished communities they leave behind. But especially thinking like there's something about like why we have Saharan deserts, why we have seemingly unfertile places and fertile places. Like that's how I don't know much about biomes, but like it seems like we need all of these different types of biodiversity to foster life in a really good way. So whatever we don't see in a desert food wise, there's purposes there. There's something
Mhm.
going on there that is beyond what we can think. So I'm with you. I think the one thing that kind of shocks me about this movie is that I just thought this was like Godzilla and Son's fun campy adventure on an island. I didn't realize that this was like kind of started with a similar, but it's funny because like the MCU is totally built on social issues.
Mhm.
Like think about like I think it's the first Avengers movie that is like about renewable energy and how Tony's moving to like have all of this renewable energy, and the conflict of the MCU is always like status quo protecting hero versus villain with the right idea but apparently the wrong ways of going about it. So it is funny though that Son of Godzilla, for as derided as it can be, it does start with a pretty big question. Well, what the heck do we do about the global food shortages?
Yep.
And then, what it turns into is a different question. But
Absolutely. And I think, the question we would like to pose to our listeners, and we'd love to have that conversation with you is, if you consider yourself a Christian, like, how do you balance that, right? Because, we see that right now with the idea of racial justice and racial equity is, in Jamar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise, he talks about how the church has often stood in the way of racial justice and racial equity, right? And that should not be the case. But there's a certain point too where I think Christians can, have this false idea of utopia, expecting perfection in the world without realizing that ultimately God is the one who's going to bring justice, right?
mhm,
It says that vengeance is mine and mine alone. So we can strive to almost want so much justice that we're almost taking things out of God's hands. So, when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to resources, when it comes to this world itself, where is that healthy balance of remembering that what we perceive now is just a shadow of what's to come, right?
right.
All of these things will fade away. We said in a previous episode, I was born, I was formed from dust, and to dust I shall return, right? But then there's also that idea of, well, what happens now also matters. We can't just assume that because there's a eternity waiting for us that like what's happening now will reverberate throughout eternity as well. Yes, God is on the throne, God will make all things right. But that doesn't give us an excuse to let injustices fly in the name of, left behindism. So I think
Yep.
it's a hard balance. It really is. I don't think I've ever really seen anyone make, because there's so many different topics this bleeds into, right? So it's
Mhm,
not just um, an easy answer. But I think this goes into our final topic of what we want to discuss is, what do we owe to each other? Because I think
mhm,
that's something that plays into that as well is, if there is no eternity, does it really matter what we do now? Right?
right.
Because, if we're just going to die and cease to exist, does my injustice now matter if there's no real eternal ramifications for it? But on the other hand, we can't just assume that, what I don't know. Does that make sense? So I think,
Yeah.
we have to kind of parse that out a little bit where in this film, we see a very clear several instances of inclusion and adoption in this film.
Mhm,
Um, More so than just Godzilla and Minya. So before we get into that, the phrase "what do we owe to each other?" If that sounds familiar, it's actually a book by a philosopher named Tim Scanlon, who was actually his ideas of contractualism were quite prominent in that book itself in the show. It's a little show called The Good Place,
mhm. You may
and
have heard of it.
you may have heard of it. And it's actually the title of episode 6 of season 1. So I'm not going to obviously get any spoilers of later seasons or the summary, the finale of that season if you've never watched the show. But the main character, Eleanor Shellstrop, has promised to help Michael, who is the architect of the afterlife that she's in, find the problem of why the neighborhood's falling apart, right? The thing is, she knows she's the problem, but she has promised to help him. So she's struggling to do the right thing here, right? It's this idea of, I would kind of say a very crude definition of contractualism is if a community has agreed to uphold a certain set of ideals, that we must act in accordance to those ideals in a way that no one would disagree with said choice. So what we see in Son of Godzilla is when Goro lands on the island, he's welcomed into this community as long as he helps carry the load, right? So now he's going to start cooking. Now he's going to start helping with the scientific, the research and the projects. And, his inclusion ends up being invaluable because as we've indicated, they didn't do a very good job of researching and surveying the island. So he discovers Seiko, and her resourcefulness saves the day several times, whether it's the water, the water and the fever, knowing how to defeat Kumonga. So we see that they're both Goro and Seiko are welcomed into the community. Seiko herself is an orphan, right? Her mother died at birth. Her father died on the island. Now she has a home within this research group. So I think it's interesting. Again, we could talk about Godzilla and Minilla, but we already had. But just this idea of like, what do we owe to each other? Because some of these scientists were like, well, let's just send him packing. They're like, well, what are we going to do? Like have him swim? No, he's going to stay with us, but he's going to help. Right. And that's part of a community is what, even Paul says, if you're going to earn your wages, you have to work. Right. That's part of being in a community is doing your work. But if you're going to be a part of a community, you have an obligation to serve and help others as well.
Yeah, that's not a capitalist you have to be productive to have value statement. That's a community is built on mutual submission and mutual working together for the good of the community. So what we're not saying is you have to produce to be valuable. We're not saying that you have to be you have to do X amount to be considered a human being. But we're just saying like if true community is built on being there for each other, building and loving one another that way, instead of just being like a mooch, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of an old coworker of mine. She was stuck in a relationship. Her and this guy, they had a couple kids together, and she was working full time as a hairstylist and just busting her butt while her boyfriend was at home playing poker. That's all he did. And the money that she would make would go towards his gambling habits. Now you could say, why didn't she do anything about that? But obviously he's the father of her kids. There's this feeling of like, she feels like she owes him something, right? We're talking about what do we owe to each other? But he wasn't upholding his part of that contractualism, right? This idea that what he's doing was not good for the family or her. So I think there's this element of, again, yeah, we're not what we produce, but when we are part of a community, there is a certain sense of obligation that we need to help and serve others. And in a marriage, it's not, we see in Christian circles this idea that the man is the head of the household and, the woman should just be cleaning and doing all this stuff. Like, yes, like in our family, I am the one who's working and my wife is the one with, home with the kids, but we agreed on that. Like we sat down and we talked about that, and that's what we wanted to do. So we have made that contract in our marriage of I will work and she will help with the kids at home. But if it ever got to the point where she was like, I want to start working again, we would, redo the contract and figure out what it would be. And, we would make that work. But like, because we agreed to that, I have to go to work and bust my butt and sell as many cars as I can to uphold my part of the contract. And she's at home taking care of our kids and making sure that, that part of our family is, she's an amazing mother. So, she's doing that part to uphold, it's just this, you can't be in a community and not work alongside others and help others. Otherwise, that's a dysfunctional community.
Right. And I think I think, well, just to be clear, in case anyone's listening and heard the wrong part, in no world is Jesus mad if the woman works
Oh,
and
no,
the
not at all.
man stays home. Like, if I felt like we should just clarify that because people are going to tell you differently, but he's not. But like, I think we feel this, like, the New Testament all the time talks about mutuality.
Hmm.
Like, we can say like the one another statements where what we do for one another, but like it seems even ingrained in us as humans, right? When you see someone doing chores and you can't just sit, you feel like you have to be like, you have to help them out with those chores. Like you hate watching people do them alone.
Yep,
So I think we know deep down that we can't just like, we do work with and for one another in those ways.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what we see with Goro, right? He's willing to go and start cooking, even if he is using the laundry basket as a way to hydrate the vegetables, right? I
Yeah,
love
wow.
that, like the special seasoning. Um, but there's no real squabbling about that. That's just an understood idea that if you're going to be a part of a community, if you're going to be brought in, there is an element of you having to help with that.
Hmm.
And throughout The Good Place, we see that as well of a community that is self-forming, but they're continually finding ways to take care of each other. And Eleanor, even being the very selfish person she is, continually is finding ways where, like in that episode, before we even see any real character development, she realizes that like I'm the problem here. I'm willing to give myself up to
Hmm.
fix this. Of course, Michael says, the problem is me, and we realize why down the road. But if he wouldn't have said anything, like I think she really would have done something, right? And that
Hmm.
she realizes like these people are suffering and hurting because of my actions, or that's what she perceives to be the case. And she's like, I owe it to these people to end their suffering,
Hmm.
right? So I think it's interesting again, we're talking about a movie where Godzilla adopts a child that is not his and learns how to parent and learns how to take care of Minya. But in the same way, we see human characters kind of doing the same thing, where
Hmm.
it's like we have before we welcomed you, like they have no obligation. Well, you would argue maybe they don't have an obligation to do anything for Goro or Seiko. But as human beings, do we not have an obligation to take care of our brother and sister? Right? Is
Hmm.
that not what Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount? Like, love those who are persecute you. So if we're called to love our enemies, how much more are we called to love people who are in need? How much more are we
Hmm.
called to love people, who are crying out for in pain? Like we look at what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I see so many Christians who are like, well, this isn't my problem, right? I haven't owned slaves. I haven't done this and that. The problem is you have brothers and sisters who are crying out for pain, who want help, who are continually being weighed down by systems who don't give a flip about, their well-being. And they're just asking for help. And we're sitting
Hmm.
here saying, well, it's not my problem. The crux of the Christian message is that
It is.
God heard the cries of his people crying out, because sin is oppression, right? Sin is bondage, sin is death. He heard the cries of his people and he was willing to take that pain and oppression and sin upon himself, even though it was not his fault and his responsibility and his he took it on so we could have freedom. How much
Hmm.
more are we called as Christians when we see our brothers and sisters crying out in pain and willing to bear that cross, right? Wasn't it Simon? Jesus is carrying the cross. It wasn't Simon's responsibility to carry that, carry the cross for Jesus, but he did it anyway. It was not Jesus' responsibility to take Barabbas's death, but he did it anyway, right?
Hmm.
And that's what we owe to each other, is the fact that we are called to bear one another's burdens. And this movie does a phenomenal job of demonstrating that, even if
Yeah,
it isn't explicit.
I agree.
Let's stand. um, so yeah, I I think it's funny. A lot of people just kind of write this movie off, and I had more fun thinking about this movie than I have probably for the last few. Well, I wouldn't say I had
Yeah.
fun thinking about Frankenstein. That was a pretty heavy movie, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like it was surprising to me. I feel like how much we were able to get out of this.
Yeah. And I'll just make one last quick point with my eye on the time. Um, how many Trinitarian themes are in this movie.
Hmm.
You know, there are 3 people who play Godzilla, just as there are 3 persons in the Trinity. You know, this does deal with father and son, Godzilla the father, and Minya the son. And even you earlier called Jun Fukuda the Holy Spirit. So there's just so many Trinitarian themes just built into this. So when Godzilla steps on Minya's tail, that's the perichoretic dance that the patristics talk about in the life of the Trinity.
Okay, yeah, that's a little bit of a stretch, but anyway, yeah, I had fun discussing this movie. I'm curious if I would we would love to hear your thoughts about if you disagreed with us, agreed with us, if you think maybe we need to lay off the recreational drugs a little bit. Let us know what you think.
Or lay on.
Yeah, actually, maybe we do need to do a little bit more. No, okay,
But
kidding.
you know what's funny though? You talk about this one being more fun to think about and have more to talk about. You know, we frequently said in the past, like, oh, this is a bad movie. There's nothing to discuss. And then it's our longest episode.
Yeah.
Oh, this was a good movie. There's nothing to discuss. It's a long episode. This one's like, people say this is a bad movie, but there's a ton to discuss.
Yeah.
And it's a long, I mean, it's funny that, like, if you had asked me before which ones would have little to talk about, I would put this right on top.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we both kind of are like, wow, there's a lot we still haven't said that could be maybe not an entire second episode, but
No.
maybe even a second episode.
No.
Not that if you're listening and you don't like this movie, we're not doing this one again, so you don't have to skip 2 weeks.
Yeah. Speaking of next week, movie we're discussing next week is King Kong Escapes.
King Kong escapes his first release date, his second release date, and the year 2020.
Oh, that's a good one. But we will have a special guest on for that, so that should be fun.
Not King Kong.
It is not
He
King Kong.
escaped
No.
our schedule.
Anyway, before we close out the episode, I wanted to give a shout out to Jay. So we've answered some of his questions, quoted some of his tweets on here, Jay St. G. So he just started a YouTube channel called Nerd Cage Live. I haven't been able to listen to it yet, but as someone who's been a very vocal supporter of the show, I just felt obligated to give him a shout out. So if you're needing a new show to listen to, make sure to look him up on YouTube. Yeah, I figure might as well share the love there. But again, thank you. What's up?
We could write him a theme song and coming out of our nerd cage, and we're doing just fine.
Okay, anyway, thank you again, everyone, for tuning into the Kaiju Apostle podcast. If you like what you heard, have a comment you'd like to share, or again, if you think we're just high, let us know over on our Twitter or Instagram pages, which, to be honest, I'm not even really on Instagram much these days. But our handle for both is Kaiju Apostle Pod, or you can email at us at contact@thekaijuapostle.com. You can also follow Chris on Twitter at Chris Worms, and this is our chance for you to tell us which Sentai you're watching.
I am just about on Kaku Ranger.
Okay.
But I ordered the Birth of Ultraman Blu-ray.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard about that?
Yeah. It has
got like 6 or 7 episodes.
Yep.
So I'll probably be kind of in that world for a little bit.
Yeah. Ultraman's interesting. I haven't really been able to finish the first series yet, but Jasper and I started watching Ultraman Z. I've had a lot of fun.
Right?
Yeah. I've had a lot of fun with that. I'm actually pretty surprised. So yeah, if you want to talk Sentai with him or even Ultraman, because now he's going to be watching a few of those episodes, make sure to follow him there on Twitter. And lastly, reviews are awesome. If you leave us one, we'd be happy to read it. But ultimately, having those ratings help us rank better on search engines, because people do go on, they're trying to find Kaiju podcasts. Maybe they're not on Twitter, right? So any of those reviews do go a long way. But ultimately, if you're listening to this, just hit us up. Let's talk. We're not doing this podcast for our own sake. We'd love to keep this conversation going. But until next time, I think we still need to find a way to end this show consistently. So if you have
still on other podcasts,
I should have come prepared. Um,
Oh, for the Bam Bam listeners. Till next time, kiss your dad, Godzilla straight on the lips.
and I realized we didn't pour one out, so we can do that.
Oh,
Like,
no.
I'll do it at the end of the episode. Okay, so really quick, let's go ahead and pour one out. For mine, there weren't really a lot of deaths, but I thought the whole like Kamikurus where his arm goes flying off in a big fiery fireball, that was
Mm,
pretty neat. That was a
dang
cool
it.
little effect there. Is that what
Yeah,
you're
I was
gonna
gonna
do?
say I was gonna say either the one destroyed by the atomic breath or Godzilla's parenting when he gets child services called on him.
Yeah.